Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Henry Sanderson, author of Volt Rush, The Winners and Losers in the Race to Go Green. Henry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're honored to have you here today. I'm a self-proclaimed book nerd, and your book was great. It was fantastically awesome, and for our listeners, it's highly recommended. I highly recommend that you go on Amazon and order Volt Rush, The Winners and Losers in the Race to Go Green. Henry did an incredible job shaping where we're going in an EV future and documenting all the things that have happened to where we are today. So Henry, thanks for writing the book first and foremost. And as a self-proclaimed book nerd, why did you write the book?
So I wrote the book because I was covering commodities at the Financial Times, and it emerged that we're going to need all these minerals to make the energy transition, to make EVs on a mass scale. And I really wanted to capture the idea that the energy transition, the move to clean energy, wasn't as simple as just putting up some solar panels or wind turbines or just swapping your car for electric. That actually involves the creation of whole new supply chains and opening people's eyes to what this means. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, we have to do it. I'm not saying it's worse than fossil fuels, no way. I'm just saying let's open our eyes, because we've got a chance to build these supply chains from scratch. Let's build them in the best possible way. And also on top of that, you've got the geopolitical nature of these supply chains, and China's dominated a lot of them. So not only have we got to build them for clean energy, but we've got to perhaps build them with more resilience in mind when we come to geopolitics and a reliance on China. So it's this whole nature of what's needed to make this transition and what people need to understand about what's needed.
We have to understand what's needed. On the other side, we do have the geopolitical issues. We have the child labor issues in the DRC, which we'll get into in a minute. But then you have the large global OEMs that, in my opinion, they were caught flat-footed. In the book, you highlighted a story, which I've talked about on several podcasts, in 2017 when VW invited a group of cobalt traders to their headquarters in Germany. They were there in the football stadium. They put them in different suites. VW has this meeting. They propose buying cobalt at fixed prices for a discount. Lo and behold, the commodity traders say, no discount. And it seemed that you've documented in the book, VW was caught flat-footed. How were they so caught flat-footed for one of the key ingredients they need to make this electric future?
You know, a lot of these car companies didn't quite believe the EV revolution was real, and they had to be, in a way, sort of pushed by Tesla into the market. And the thing is, you know, EVs are, car making in general is hard, but making EVs is hard. And the battery is at the heart of that, because it's one of the most expensive parts. And I think Volkswagen, they thought of batteries and other things as commodities that they, as big car makers, could just buy, and the suppliers would come running to be part of the VW supply chain, you know. And probably that's how it's worked up till now, right? With makers of, you know, widgets or whatever, you know, they just expand production to meet the needs of VW. But the mining industry is much more difficult, because, you know, building new mines is hugely complicated and hugely difficult. In some ways, the more production you have, you know, might be higher up the cost curve, so, you know, prices need to go up. So I think, you know, miners held, and still do hold, a lot of the cards, because they've got these materials, right? And you're either going to pay what they want, or you're not going to get these materials. And, you know, you're not going to go into DRC and develop a mine, right? So they're very beholden to the miners for some of these niche minerals, because in many cases, they're not huge markets like steel or aluminium, where, you know, you can just buy, you know, on the market. In many cases, production needs to expand to meet demand from OEMs. So the OEMs need the miners. So you have this really interesting culture clash between Volkswagen and the cobalt traders. And the cobalt market is small. They all know each other. It's mostly centered around the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not an easy place. It's a complicated place. So culture clash, where they were saying, we need this, you give it to us. And the cobalt guys were saying, wait a second, you know, we've got the cobalt, you know, that you need. You know, how about we have a better deal, right? Or a deal is more favorable to us. So I think sort of opened their eyes to what was needed in the supply chain. And we've seen now VW go into making its own batteries, launching this company PowerCo. So it's very much now they want to take all these battery issues in-house and in a sense do as much as they can themselves.
Why? They have the resources. They cooked up the idea for Dieselgate. I had one of those vehicles that was recalled as part of Dieselgate. They have the resource. Why didn't they hire somebody like yourself out of the Financial Times when you're there as a commodities reporter or a commodities consultant and hopped on a plane and went to Switzerland and sat down with Glencore to really learn and understand how this goes? It just seems that they went in there flying blind.
Yes, I think a lot of the car makers have left it perhaps too late. And now we're entering a sort of zero-sum situation where there's only a limited amount of new raw materials coming on or existing raw materials, and car makers now are all scrambling to secure supply, especially in things like lithium, where there's going to be a shortage. So I think they have left it a bit late, and in some senses that's because they've relied on other sections of the supply chain to secure the raw materials. We buy batteries from you, you sort out the raw materials, or we buy cathode and you sort out the raw materials. But now they're realizing they have to help stimulate new production and do what they can to stimulate new supply coming to the market, because without they can't meet their targets for EV production. So I think it is interesting because we saw Tesla perhaps move in advance of a lot of other EV makers in terms of securing supply. And they went into the Chinese market, obviously, in a big way. And then, we're seeing now GM do lots of deals, seeing Ford do lots of deals. So it's really now the competition's become very intense.
Well, the competition's intense. What happens if the Japanese jump in? Sony in 1991 commercialized the lithium-ion battery. They're currently working on the Vision S EV. What if they jump in? So then you also have the big South Koreans that with LG Chem, with SK Innovation developing it. What happens if the Japanese jump in again?
So it's very interesting because the US market, the way we're seeing it develop, is that it's going to be the Japanese and Koreans that basically are the American supply chain. And it's sort of fascinating to see that the whole US shift to EVs is being, supported. It was going to be on the back of these Korean and Japanese companies. So obviously Panasonic already has the biggest gigafactory, with Tesla in Nevada, but LG is expanding massively with GM. And you're right, even the Sony EV is going to be, I think, made in Ohio for the US market. So it is quite interesting geopolitically because the US is lucky to have these allied countries in Korea, Japan, who are not aligned necessarily with China to support the growth of the electric vehicle supply chain in the US. Otherwise, I just don't know how it would happen basically without these companies and countries.
Because you're right about the geopolitics. Let's get into China for a minute. It seems to me there's a lot of really, I would say, brilliant reporting in your book, Vault Rush, about President Xi, the rise of President Xi. What role did him as party secretary to gig the home to CATL play in championing the homegrown Chinese battery? Because as you document in the book, and I'm reading the tea leaves here, it seems that President Xi saw a strategic vision for China. Everybody says it's emissions, but to me it seems, based on his public remarks, that China can grab the land share and control that market and become the Saudi Arabia 2.0.
So, I mean, it's very interesting because I think Xi Jinping, you can see from his speech this week at the party congress, he's keen on the environment. He sees, if you think of the middle class as one of his key constituencies, he wants to provide clean air, clean water, etc. for the middle class. He also wants to provide the high value jobs of the future. And I think clean energy is one of these industries that China really wants the jobs and the economic growth from. And I think CATL, the founder, saw early on the way things were going in China after Xi was made party secretary and the sort of stimulus that was coming down the pipe for EVs. And CATL split off from what was a Japanese-owned company, ATL, and set up an EV battery company. And then the Japanese shareholders sold out. So it was purely Chinese because he saw what was coming down the pipe, which was huge stimulus for Chinese companies and creating a Chinese giant, which CATL has done spectacularly, where it's almost so big now that it's just very dominant in the EV and now energy storage market. So it is a really interesting story of one company, benefiting from subsidies, from protectionism, but also from entrepreneurial zeal of the founder and the team, ending up so dominant that now many foreign EV makers have done deals with CATL and they're expanding into Europe. And I say in the book, in the heartland of German auto industry, they've set up this battery factory and they're going to build one in Hungary as well. It's the biggest foreign investment in Hungary, I think, to date. So they're really spreading their wings around the world. And energy storage, many of the US deals and elsewhere, those will be batteries from CATL. So it aligned perfectly with Xi Jinping's vision of what he wants for China. Now, of course, there is fear about becoming so big, and no one gets so big in the Chinese system without protection, without the party allowing it. So, yes, of course, I think it helped that Xi Jinping had that background in Ningde. And of course, they must have their protectors in the system to get so big. We saw what happened with the technology companies like Alibaba, how quickly you can fall from grace in China. But saying that, I do think it does align with Xi Jinping's vision. But I think we are going to see more competition internally in China to try and capture some of CATL's market.
You alluded to it. I'm going to dive into it. It seems that Robin, the founder of CATL, learned the Jack Ma lesson. He keeps it very low profile. The same with the BYD team. They're not out there high profile. Is that for strategic reasons as they grow, not to upset or poke or prod the Communist Party?
Exactly right. I think, I don't know for sure, but I think you're right. He has maintained a low profile. He doesn't give a lot of interviews. He doesn't, as far as we can see, he's not someone who mingles with the jet set internationally. You don't at least see, huge properties overseas. You don't see conspicuous consumption from him. He's an engineer. He has been involved in batteries for a long time from ATL. So I think you're right. Keeping a low profile these days is probably quite a good strategy. And you certainly don't see, him sort of striding about as much as perhaps, we saw from Alibaba, Jack Ma before. So it is uncertain times being a big private company in China, but what they've achieved is incredible. And the next big question for them is, can they keep growing? Can they conquer the European market and perhaps even make moves into the US depending on the political situation?
The political situation in China is going to get interesting. Before we get into that, I want to go back because in 2013, President Xi gave the Maritime Silk Road speech in Indonesia, and it seems that throughout Xi's state as president, he's been giving, let's call it, very strategic speeches around the world about the EV battery supply chain. He's making them in strategic locations. Was this a move, in your opinion, to further boost China's EV battery dominance, where the speeches are being made, and then as part of that speech, China's announcing an investment of X amount of dollars in that country? For Indonesia, for example, is the nickel?
I don't think it's specifically targeted at EVs, but it's all part of making the world safer for China's rise and knitting countries together into a sort of new China world order, if you like, a new China world system. But number one, it's making the world safer for the Communist Party to rise and trying to get these countries on side. And if you look at the Belt and Road, you're right that you've seen in Latin America, especially, loads of countries sign up. Countries, Chile was one of the first. Obviously, they're a big lithium producer and copper producer. Argentina signed up recently as well, which is interesting because we've seen lots of investment into Argentina as well. So it's not specifically targeted, but it's all part and parcel of the same strategic goals. And you can see that having countries like Chile and Argentina sign up, it was, of course, knits them into China and encourages Chinese investment in those countries.
We have the Communist Party meetings are going right now, and President Xi has made some rhetoric towards Taiwan that has politicians from Japan to South Korea to the United States talking. If China does get aggressive towards Taiwan, do they get the Russia treatment on the global stage? And if so, does that impact them on EVs?
Yeah, so I think China's obviously been watching the Russian situation very closely and, watching the sanctions on Russia. And I think, they definitely don't like the way the dollar is so dominant in world trade. And I think, it's interesting because when I lived in China, there was big moves to try and make offshore renminbi used more in transactions, but it hasn't really gone that far, hasn't really succeeded, I wouldn't say, to what they want. But they're trying new things such as, the electronic currency, which possibly could evade sanctions. I think they definitely don't want to be held hostage by the Western world or cut off. But I think on the other hand, what you've seen in the isolation with Russia is I think, China's benefited hugely from globalization. And I think it'd be to their detriment to be completely isolated from global markets. So I don't necessarily think they would take that risk. But definitely what we see from what Xi Jinping is saying is that he wants China to be more self-reliant. So he's very aware. And with the US recent days halting the semiconductor exports to China, that's a very, very strong, big move, huge step. And from what I read, US citizens employed in the sector have had to just leave their jobs. So in a way, he wants them to be more self-reliant, but in a way he has to, right? Given some of the things the US is coming up with. But I do think that any invasion of Taiwan, they'd have to calculate. As I say, they've done very well from the global economy. A lot of these companies we're talking about today in the battery supply chain, they want to invest in Europe, they want to invest overseas. So, they would hugely damage all of their integration into the global economy. And it is amazing when you get to the sort of nuts and bolts of it, how integrated China is into the global economy, and especially in clean energy, where you've got 80% of the solar supply chain, 90% of rare earth magnets, 80% of lithium-ion batteries, processing of almost all these minerals in China. So it's they benefit hugely from the global business that some of these companies are now getting.
You have to give China credit. They've made strategic investments when other countries weren't going to do. You had a great line in the book: Chinese money does not come with lectures as it relates to the Congo, and they were able to secure the cobalt and copper there. How is China operating at such a strategic advantage when it comes to the EV supply chain, when other countries, for that matter of fact, are seeming to play catch up on China's strategy?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think it's all sort of one big strategy that's been laid out, but I think what happened is that countries like the DRC, you had a sort of confluence of quite interesting factors, which is that you had the Kabila regime, you had many sort of Western mining companies that weren't willing at that time to go into, let's say, risky countries, because the Western mining investors were saying, hey, we've had enough of risky deals, just pay us dividends, don't take any risks. So it's kind of open in the DRC for Chinese companies to come in. And, the Kabila regime, obviously, there's lots of allegations of corruption, etc. So Western mining companies, with a few exceptions, were probably not that interested to enter the DRC. But now I think because China has gone into the DRC in such a big way, now the West is really re-engaging with the country. And we're seeing the US really re-engage with the DRC. And the DRC, under the new administration, wants to sort of attract not just Chinese investors, but try to hedge some of its exposure a bit. So that's sort of an interesting situation about the West now realizing what's gone on. But you've got to remember, a lot of these opportunities that China took advantage of were on the open market, and this is what I find so fascinating is you talk about sort of one strategy, but actually it's a lot of the time it's deals on the market, using foreign lawyers, using foreign investment banks. They bought this stake in Australia's biggest, or the biggest lithium mine on the planet in Australia with no obstacles, with lots of foreign lawyers, banks, etc. They've gone into the DRC to invest in these projects. These were all opportunities that were available to Western companies. It wasn't, in many cases, sort of hidden strategy. And actually, if you look at the most state-led investments, they're the ones that haven't done well. So a lot of the times in my book, I'm talking about these entrepreneurial private companies who have gone out and done this. So it's when we talk about sort of one strategy, actually it's a lot of entrepreneurial companies that have across clean energy and solar, etc., that have really come to the fore in this transition. So that's why I think that Xi Jinping's sort of push for more state control is not really an ideal solution. At least what we've seen from clean energy is the entrepreneurial zeal that China has.
On the private market side, Glencore is in the DRC in a very big way, and they're using an Israeli businessman as a middleman. They've gotten in a lot of trouble with that. How did that come about?
It's Dan Gertler, who's a mysterious figure who's been sanctioned by the US for alleged corrupt deals with former President Joseph Kabila. He turned up, it's an interesting story because he turned up at the DRC when it's fair to say no one really wanted to invest in the country. It was the civil war was ending. It had been a devastating civil war, and he turned up to invest. So he did manage to get involved in a lot of these copper and cobalt projects, and he was a business partner with Glencore. And, him and Glencore ended up controlling, I'd say, the two best copper and cobalt projects in the DRC. Mutanda's one of them, KCC, Komoto Copper Mine is one of the other ones. And, so you got to this stage when cobalt demand started to increase because of EVs. You had Glencore sitting with two amazing assets just at the time when cobalt demand came along. But unfortunately, they had this business partner in Dan Gertler. So Glencore moved to remove Dan Gertler from ownership from these mines. He sold his stakes in these assets, but unfortunately, he was still getting paid royalties at the time. Taxes from the sale of minerals. So Glencore's come under a lot of scrutiny for that relationship. And the problem was all that scrutiny was coming to the surface just as this EV revolution was taking off, and Glencore was in prime position. So you had this real tricky trade-off for a lot of automakers, which is Glencore is a Western provider of cobalt, the world's biggest producer, but it does have this history in the DRC with Dan Gertler. And that has been a real sort of conundrum for a lot of automakers. But saying that, they have been one of the only Western mining companies to invest in the DRC and develop these mines under difficult circumstances. And I think probably now when we're looking at this EV transition, we probably need more risk taking from the mining sector than we've had in the past.
We do need more risk taking. As part of the reporting for the book, you visited the DRC. You documented that. What was that like on the ground experience? You highlighted a sad story around the children in the backyards of the homes or the sides of the road, just using their hands with no equipment to pull out the cobalt. Is that still actively happening today? And what was your experience like in the Congo?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating place to visit because from the very beginning, you get a sense of the geopolitics. My plane to Lubumbashi was full of Chinese people. I'd say over 50% Chinese. When you arrive in Kolwezi, which is the mining area, you see, I remember there's a Chinese casino, Chinese restaurant, and all along the road are Chinese depots where anyone can just take their cobalt and sack to sell. And you see the sort of real ground level impact of our demand for metals and minerals, and the very sad, tough story of people just digging by hand with no safety protection, no sort of investment in their conditions, and they just sell this cobalt to most of the time these Chinese traders. Then it gets exported out of the DRC. So I think when you're there, you see the contrast between that and then these big mining companies who are there, who drive around in pickup trucks with little red flags on the back, who live in gated communities, who work at these massive mines that are behind huge gates, huge security, really walled off from the rest of the country. So you've got these two different systems operating side by side, and they do come into uneasy contact where a lot of these local miners try to mine the mining concessions, etc. So there's this uneasy existence, and also the sense that so much of the cobalt that we use in our smartphones elsewhere has come from this area of the world, and there's just so little in return, so little investment, so little done to improve there is some done, to be fair, but there's a long way to go to improve the livelihood of these people. But I think what's happening now is the DRC government wants to clean up informal mining. They want to set up this government-owned company that will buy up the supply from the miners and try to give them a fair price and try to regulate the industry a bit. And we have seen automakers, engage a bit more in the DRC.
Is it even possible to regulate the cobalt industry in the DRC based on its history?
It's a good point, but I don't think we should just run away because we feel, a bit cynical about their chances. I think you can probably control some of it, and we should make an effort rather than just running away, because this material is going to get out anyway via China. So I think if more of it can be controlled, if more can be protected, if more can be done, then that's much better, and we should do that. I think what needs to happen is that we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good, in the sense that your automakers probably have to take on some risk in dealing with the country, and that it might not, we're trying to improve the conditions. It's hard to make everything perfect. So we have to be willing to buy material with the knowledge that, we may have improved conditions, rather than what used to happen, which is everyone just shut their eyes and the material still got out to China anyway, right? So this is the challenge that's going on, which is, can we buy some of this, consciously buy this informal mining in a way that we're happy with conditions that are improved? But I do agree, it's a very, very difficult situation. But the DRC is one of those countries that I think wants to benefit from the energy transition. And when you think of developing countries being victims of climate change, we need to help them. We need to step in.
One of those countries highlighted again in the book was Indonesia. You highlighted the nickel mines with the runoff into the ocean. I dive, I snorkel, I love swimming on a coral reef. That's going to have a negative impact on the environment. Do we get to the point where consumers start demanding transparency? So Indonesia has some beautiful reefs, the world-renowned surf spots, where this nickel runoff is going in. They're saying, okay, we're not going to buy your vehicle because you're hurting world-renowned surf spots and fish, where the transparency comes into play?
Precisely. Yeah, we need, one of the reasons, going back to why I wrote this book, is to open our eyes to these supply chains. So that exactly right. So that consumer pressure can help improve it, because at the end of the day, it serves no one if we're producing these EVs but damaging, as you say, pristine environments. And there's no reason why that has to be the case. It's only consumers, who close their eyes or don't give attention that kind of thing can be got away with. But the good thing about the EV is being a green product, being a product that's supposed to be good for the environment. It's unlikely that we can continue to have these sort of abuses in the supply chain. And I think you are seeing pressure to clean things up, right? If Indonesia, and they know, and the DRC knows, if they want to be part of this energy transition and get the benefits, they have to work to clean up these supply chains, along with the automotive companies and everyone else involved. And Indonesia itself has a net zero target. It needs to increase more renewable energy, because one of the issues is a lot of these nickel processing plants are using fossil fuels. So that needs to be sorted out. And the waste issue, there are solutions. It has to be sorted out. I mean, in this whole transition, the opportunity for innovation is huge, and it's not beyond our wit as man to solve some of these issues. And I think you're exactly right. Consumer pressure, as we've seen in cobalt, can actually really play a big part.
While there's a lot of innovation going on, why is there not more discussions around the processing and refining of minerals? We saw the announcement where Tesla's looking in Texas to do it, but meanwhile, China just keeps pulling ahead with refining. Why is there not more innovation around that? Where's the John D. Rockefeller of this generation to get refineries? And then where's his business partner in Henry Flagler to build out the transportation network from rail to eventually pipelines?
It's a really good question. I'd say it's coming, because the pressure now, especially for automotive companies, to create supply chains not involving China is huge, right? With this Inflation Reduction Act in the US, this is a huge subsidy and stimulus to build up a supply chain in the US and put the US's amazing talent of innovation, of free market capital, R&D, not towards creating apps, but to actually building stuff and creating new ways of processing. And this is really the key, which is China dominates the processing route. So we need to sort out the processing. Then materials can come from free trade countries, allied countries like Australia and Canada, and pre-processed in the US. This is really so critical. Building things is hard. You need permitting. We've got inflationary problems at the moment, which is not making things easy. Obviously, high energy prices, inflations for building materials, etc. So it's not an easy time, but we need that part of the supply chain to be reshored in the West. That's really so critical. I would say it's not going to be easy, and perhaps initially, while these supply chains are being set up, automakers may have to pay a slight premium until they get up to competitive standard, but to support the establishment of these industries. So that's what's going to be really interesting to see, is how the automakers deal with that. But the pressure now is really strong.
You look at Texas, for example, there's a lot of open land. You have the ability to set up microgrids that can run off of solar. Perhaps that becomes for the processing plants. You have the really interesting development in the Salton Sea in California. If that works, because consumers are going to demand to know, was this made with renewable energy? Do we get to the point where the consumers start asking around that? Okay, well, my car is really not as clean as you say it is because it wasn't refined using renewable energy?
Yeah, so I think consumers, I think as EVs become more mass market items, I think you're right. The pressure and the scrutiny of the supply chain, I've already seen it become, from what was a very niche topic I was covering as a journalist to being a much more prominent topic. And I think that's good. And that's in line with, as EVs become more mass market, people are going to be much more aware of, is this stuff built using clean energy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the other thing is just from a cost perspective, automakers need to get the price of EVs, down towards internal combustion engines. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to help with that task. But at least initially, in the near term, we face this raw material inflationary pressure. So they're very keen also just to develop, if you develop with clean energy, with more sustainable, supplies, it can also help with costs, especially things like recycling. So you've got these cost pressures as well that I think will drive probably more sustainability in the supply chain.
We need infrastructure. Going back to China, they refine 44% of the world's lithium, 75% of the world's cobalt, and produces 78% of the world's cathode, which accounts for 91% of anode production. Hello, we need to wake up and bring that infrastructure back online. How did China initially develop that infrastructure to get those giant market shares?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story in that I think, China, as I discovered in my book, had a lot of the electronic supply chain. And if you look at all the companies, they all developed out of that. Like CATL came out of ATL, which was supplying batteries for smartphones and things. The cobalt guys are the same, the nickel guys, etc. They all came out of either it's for the electronics industry or actually, sorry, nickel more from stainless steel, sort of heavy industries that China's done, so well to dominate. Steel, obviously, China has, surpassed anyone to be a huge producer, right? So a lot of these either heavy industries or electronic supply chain. And a lot of ways, it's the sort of dirty parts that the West never wanted, right? And production shifted to China because it was labor was a huge advantage, 20 years ago. It could do these things cheaper. Environmental standards were just so much weaker. So it's all the classic case of offshoring with not paying for any of these externalities, right? You're damaging the environment. You're not, labor's cheap. Now China's lost a lot of that advantage, and now is a different story. But that's, I think, really at the root of China's emergence as a dominant player, so that when EVs came along, they could move up the value chain because they saw the opportunity. And also China's EV market generated momentum before the Western EV market. So there's this whole confluence of factors, and things like Chinese EV buses, that market grew hugely. And yeah, so they're in a good place to benefit from that. But I think now we see both in China that the environmental conditions, regulations are tightening. You've got energy costs going up. You've got obviously labor costs have gone up. So now it's a different set of circumstances in China as well.
It's a different set of circumstances on the global stage. Can CATL and BYD, in your opinion, continue to gain market share? Or do they start to level out as new players come online?
So it's an interesting case of whether we're going to see a winner takes all situation, because scale is so important, right? Scale brings cost, scale brings innovation. A lot of times is what we're seeing. The big guys can innovate, and the case is we are seeing CATL take a lot, right, and making a good profit, and then all these EV startups are making losses, so essentially paying CATL to make a good profit. So the question is, whether we're just going to see BYD, CATL just get bigger and bigger, or we're going to see challenges. And we're already seeing challenges, especially in the Chinese market. And I think what we're seeing is, you've got companies like CALB, sorry, another acronym to deal with, but this is a sort of state-backed company that, as so often happens in China, sort of risen out of nowhere to be a challenger. And I think when you've got such a valuable market, I think interestingly, we might see more competition emerge out of China to challenge CATL than out of the West. At least that's what we're seeing in the near future.
Then in the UK, where you're based, the Cornwall lithium mines are trying to make a comeback. Do they make a full comeback?
It's still being developed in Cornwall, but it's, as far as I understand, it's it's going well, and there's potential there. And you've got to look at lithium prices at the moment. It's looking, I guess, it's forcing companies in the supply chain to look at lower grade deposits, to look at opportunities wherever they are. And obviously, in Europe, you'd be foolish not to consider a homegrown supply of lithium. If it, as I say, lithium is going to be short this decade, so it stands to reason that you can have a homegrown supply. And also, if there's innovation, if there's new ways of doing it, along with geothermal energy that could be cleaner, then I think that could happen. But the jury's still out in a lot of these new technologies for lithium extraction at the moment.
The other issue in Britain outside of Parliament right now is British Volt. And will that have any impact potentially on the Cornwall project?
So I think, British Volt, Cornwall, they're all sort of part of UK efforts to build a supply chain. Obviously, the government's keen on that, and they're putting a lot of attention on that. I think what's really critical for the UK is to develop battery capacity, because, we've had news this week that Mini EV, BMW is going to move electric mini production from UK to China. That's exactly what we don't want to see, and that's a sort of sad signal that we haven't built the supply chain here, because they want to move where the supply chain is, right? So the UK needs to build battery factories, whether that's foreign companies or homegrown. Obviously, homegrown is difficult. It's a tough business. But we've seen Northvolt in Sweden, I write about in the book, is an amazing story of, yes, they've had their difficult times and it's not been easy, but they have starting to produce batteries. It's a capital intense business. This, I think, is the challenge with British or anyone else. It's a very capital intense business, and it's not easy. And yeah, you need to be competitive. But I do think if the UK doesn't have battery capacity, then we're in a sort of serious situation.
I'll go out and I'll make a prediction that I've made before. I'm a fan of UK cars. The UK is synonymous with Land Rover. I'm a very proud owner of a Range Rover. There's no reason why in the future that there should not be a gigafactory in the UK that will make an all-electric Range Rover. And my prediction is when that happens, that becomes the best-selling premium luxury SUV in the world, and it's a great win for the UK. You recently switched to a Model 3. You went from the internal combustion engine to an electric. What's your experience been like?
Amazing. I said recently that it really brought home to me the fact that, if you think about this transition, it's not just a cleaner technology, it's a better one. I do think that's fundamentally true. When you drive one, you realize how true that is, which is that we're not sacrificing any huge amount to make this transition. That's so important. It's actually a much better product. And of course, it's too expensive. And of course, the issue is we need mass market EVs. But just as a consumer, driving an EV is just so much better. It's just quiet. It accelerates instantly. It's you don't feel like you're damaging the environment. It's just a much smoother ride. And I think, some of the issues do need to be ironed out. I've become very familiar with charging issues, and it's nothing more annoying than going to a charger and it says it's out of order or it doesn't work. And I think it is a slight Wild West, the charging situation at the moment in the UK. So that, to me, that has to be ironed out. That's the number one thing I think consumers will be put off by. You have to have a flawless charging system. And to Tesla's credit, the superchargers probably are as close to that as you can imagine. They are very, very good and efficient. That's very important insight you have from driving an EV, because, of course, the early adopters will put up with some inconvenience, right? But if, the ordinary person doesn't want to be getting out, downloading a different app for each charger or filling out their details and their credit card details, it has to be flawless. And the government should support that, and also the markets, I'm hoping, will drive consolidation and more smoother processes for that.
The consolidation's coming. If we go into a global recession, that will accelerate the consolidation. I've said this before, I'll say this again. Tesla's greatest competitive advantage from day one was their charging network, because they eliminated range anxiety and they eliminated stress, knowing that it would work if your Tesla arrived there. And go team Tesla for that. Henry, in your opinion, how do you see the global supply chain for EVs evolving over the coming years? Do we get a Volt Rush 2.0 in 4 or 5 years from now?
Well, I think, watch this space, but I do think the West catching up, I think is, it's a really interesting story on a number of fronts, which is that if you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, maybe they underestimated the cohesion of the Western response, right? And maybe we're not as weak as perhaps they thought. And now you've got the situation in China, becoming increasingly authoritarian. So it's up to the West to lead and to catch up in clean energy. We've got the right systems, we've got the right incentives, we've got the talent. So this is going to be the thing to watch, which is how we catch up and how can we do it. And I do think we have lots of cards on our table. I mentioned before the Korean and Japanese companies. This is the allied network is a real advantage of the Western. China doesn't have many allies. So we've got all to play for, and there's no reason why we can't apply our talents to catching up. And I do think too much capital maybe has been misplaced on technology, on apps, things like that. We've got to consider whether there are harder problems we can work at than getting your groceries delivered to your door in 10 minutes, etc. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that evolves. But I do think this war might accelerate the move to clean energy. And that means for sure that we need to diversify our supply chains, and we don't want to be completely reliant on China.
It could further accelerate it depending on how cold you have for a winter in the UK with the energy crisis going there. As we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, Henry, what would you like our listeners to take away with them? I'll say order the book, Volt Rush. It's available on Amazon. Order it today. But what would you like our listeners to take away?
Yeah, I just like the listeners to be aware that EVs are great, but there is this supply chain behind them, and that we need to build this supply chain. And I think we've offshored a lot of awareness of supply chains and of the fact that everything we use, consume, buy, often it originates in mining or growing, right? So it comes from the earth. So we need to be aware of that fact and stop distancing ourselves from, the supply chains behind our lifestyles, behind our consumption.
If you want to learn about the global supply chain for EVs, I highly recommend you read Volt Rush, The Winners and Losers to Go Green by Henry Sanderson. It was a phenomenal read. It was an eye-opening read. And for any individual interested in EVs, buying an EV or working in the industry, I highly recommend that you read Volt Rush by Henry Sanderson, because the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is electric. Henry, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.